That night, the silence of the mansion seemed to hide secrets that only the heart could decipher. The maid, with trembling hands and a hopeful look, had prepared every detail of a candle-lit dinner. The delicate aromas of the food she had spent hours preparing wafted through the air, like invitations to a life-changing encounter. She believed that this would be the night the millionaire would finally see in her more than just the woman who tidied his rooms. She had chosen fresh flowers, set the table as if it were a royal banquet, and deep in her soul, she harbored the hope that he would enter the door alone, ready to share something beyond trivial words. But when she heard footsteps echoing through the entrance hall and saw an unfamiliar female figure arm in arm with him, her heart shattered into 1,000 silent pieces, like a crystal falling to the floor unnoticed. The millionaire, elegant in every gesture, entered smiling, unaware of the teary eyes watching him from a distance. The woman at his side, enveloped in expensive perfume and a sparkling dress, seemed to occupy the space never given to the maid. The dinner prepared with such care was now merely a backdrop for a spectacle of indifference. Each lit candle became a silent witness to the humiliation growing within her. He pulled out the stranger's chair, poured the wine with the delicacy she had so longed for, and as their laughter filled the room, the maid felt the world swallow her silently. But what no one could have imagined was that that night marked by pain and rejection would be only the first movement in a merciless twist of fate, where karma would step in to reverse every role in this story. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and comment. Fate always takes its toll. In the imposing mansion located on the outskirts of New York, where the windows reflected the distant city lights, every detail seemed carefully calculated to convey power and perfection. But within those cold walls, a heart beat differently, that of the young maid who carried in her eyes a forbidden love, impossible to confess in words, but which overflowed with every silent gesture of care. Her name was Emily, and from the first day she started working in that house, she knew her life would never be the same. There was something about the millionaire Alexander that simultaneously paralyzed and attracted her, like a fire into which a butterfly insists on throwing itself, even knowing it could be consumed. That night Emily had gotten up early, smoothed her hair in front of the simple mirror in her room, and felt a mixture of nervousness and hope that made her hands sweat. For the first time she had dared to prepare something beyond her obligation. It wasn't just dinner. It was a silent declaration, an attempt to show that her place wasn't just behind closed doors, clearing tables and clearing dishes. Each dish she chose carried the sweetness of her intention. Each seasoning placed with the precision of someone who places the hope of being noticed in flavor. The table had been set as if in the finest ballroom, glasses lined, silverware gleaming, and fresh flowers she had bought herself with the little that remained of her salary. As she lit the candles, Emily imagined what it would be like to see him walk through the door alone, tired from meetings, but surprised by that unexpected gesture. She imagined his gaze meeting hers, perhaps a surprised smile, perhaps even a sincere thank you, a moment when the silence between them would break and something new would blossom. With each fine-tuned detail, her heart raced, as if fate were about to grant her a once-in-a-lifetime chance to be seen. However, the clock seemed to mock her anxiety. The hours ticked by slowly, until the headlights of a car illuminated the mansion's entrance. Emily ran to the window, adjusted the hem of her simple dress, and took a deep breath, mentally rehearsing what she might say. But when she opened the door and saw him there, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a stunning woman, wearing a shimmering dress and a confident smile, as if the space already belonged to her. Emily felt the world spin for a moment, but she didn't let the shock show. She lowered her eyes, controlled her breathing, and made way for the two of them to enter. As Alexander walked down the hall with the stranger at his side, Emily remained motionless, trying to find the strength to maintain her composure. The carefully prepared dinner still steamed on the table, spreading a sweet aroma that now seemed cruel. She knew there was no place for her at that moment, and the feeling of invisibility hurt more than any dismissive word. With every laugh from the guest, every kind gesture from the millionaire, Emily felt her heart tighten as if it were being crushed in silence, And there, in the dim light of the hall, it became clear to her that fate had not arrived to reward her dreams. Instead, it seemed to test her with a wound that would bleed for a long time to come. Emily discreetly retreated to the kitchen, where the warm glow of the candles no longer illuminated her hope, but rather the cruel irony of a scene that didn't belong to her. Every dish placed on the table was now merely the backdrop for someone else's romance. Every moment the stranger's laughter echoed through the room. She felt as if an invisible blade pierced her soul, reminding her that the dreams she had, silently nurtured, were too fragile for reality. Yet she remained steadfast, without tears betraying her pain. There was a strength within her that wouldn't allow her to crumble before those who couldn't understand her heart. Alexander, for his part, seemed completely oblivious to Emily's presence. His gestures were elegant, every word he spoke to his guest carrying charm and confidence, as if he were conducting a show. He talked about business, about travel, about opportunities that seemed untouchable to any ordinary person, and the woman beside him smiled as if fascinated by every detail. Emily, hidden in the dim light of the kitchen, overheard fragments of the conversation, and it was as if the world reminded her that there was no room for someone like her alongside a man like Alexander. However, fate likes to play with irony. As she watched, she noticed details that escaped the superficial shine of that encounter. The stranger's smile wasn't just enchantment, there was calculation in her eyes, an intention hidden behind every delicate gesture. It wasn't love that brought her there, but the weight of the riches Alexander displayed without realizing it. Emily, in her simplicity, was the only one to see the shadow behind that sparkling smile. Even so, she could do nothing but sit back and watch. The food he had prepared was served, but there was no taste in her mouth, only the bitterness of humiliation, of being invisible, of watching the man she harbored. Unspeakable feelings for give another woman what she had always wanted: attention, care, tenderness. Dinner unfolded like a silent dance of emotions that only Emily could feel in depth. As the night wore on, and the two laughed like accomplices in the middle of the ballroom, Emily slipped out the side door and walked into the garden. The night's chill kissed her skin, and she raised her eyes to the starry sky, searching for answers that never came. The wind ruffled her hair like a whisper of fate, reminding her that even in pain there were hidden lessons. And as she watched the stars reflect in the mansion's pool, she made a silent vow. She would never let that moment be the end of her story. Deep down, Emily felt that life was preparing something greater, even though at that moment everything seemed to be falling apart. Because karma never fails, and what seemed like defeat today could tomorrow turn into the most unexpected reckoning. The next morning, the mansion looked the same. As ever, imposing, cold and silent, but for Emily nothing was the same. Her eyes bore the weight of the previous night, and her hands, accustomed to working tirelessly, trembled slightly as she tidied the dining room, which still bore traces of the dinner. The half-empty glasses, the wine-stained napkins and the stranger's perfume still lingering in the air were like invisible scars marking every corner of the house. Emily walked among the remains of that scene as if crossing a battlefield. Every detail a cruel reminder that she had prepared everything with love and received only contempt in return. As she collected the dishes, she couldn't help but let a single tear run down her face. But Emily wasn't fragile. Behind her gentle exterior lay a quiet strength, built from years of work and battles fought alone. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her apron, took a deep breath, and resolved that no one would ever see her pain. If Alexander had chosen to offer his affection to a stranger, she wouldn't beg for crumbs. There was a flame within her that wouldn't be extinguished so easily. From his upstairs office, Alexander watched the maid silently. For a moment, he noticed her weary expression, but his mind was too preoccupied with business and the memory of the night he'd spent with his guest. There was no room in his thoughts to comprehend the weight of Emily's gaze, and perhaps it was precisely this blindness that would soon lead him to pay a heavy price for his indifference. As the week went on, routine returned to normal. Emily continued to perform her tasks with impeccable dedication, but now there was a strange stillness in her movements. She no longer smiled, she didn't risk looking at Alexander as before, and even the way she served coffee seemed to have changed, as if every gesture was calculated to avoid being hurt again. The millionaire, immersed in commitments and surrounded by people who fed his ego, didn't even notice the change. But fate was already in motion. The unknown woman named Veronica soon revealed her true colors. She began visiting the mansion frequently, always smiling, always elegant, but with glances that quickly passed over the valuables, the details of the house, the secrets hidden in drawers. Emily noticed everything. It was as if her heart had become a radar for hidden intentions, and with each visit from Veronica, the feeling grew stronger that this story would end in tragedy for Alexander. Emily, however, remained silent. What could she say? That the woman he so courted was driven by self-interest, that the sparkle in her eyes hid ambition. No one would believe a maid. So she simply watched, carrying within her a mixture of pain and foreboding, knowing that sooner or later, life would exact its toll on every choice made at that candle-lit table. And in his thoughts, a phrase echoed like a prophecy: everything that is built on illusions ends up crumbling. The following days brought a new rhythm to the mansion. Veronica now appeared frequently, as if she were already part of that luxurious universe. Her laughter echoed through the hallways, her heels clicked confidently on the marble, and her every gesture seemed calculated to leave a mark. She spoke to Alexander as an equal, discussing investments, praising his achievements, and gradually infiltrated the routine of the house like an elegant shadow. Alexander, flattered by the attention of such a beautiful and confident woman, surrendered himself to her company without questioning her intentions. Emily, silent, was merely a spectator in a play that seemed to follow a predictable script. With her watchful eyes, she noticed every detail that escaped her master's notice. Veronica never looked Alexander in the eye for long, quickly looking away as if calculating her next move. When she walked through the mansion, her eyes roamed the paintings, the family jewels, the discreetly stored safes. Emily felt her heart ache with every gesture, but she kept her mouth shut, knowing that her word would never be worth anything compared to the fascination Veronica held over him. Alexander, accustomed to being admired, didn't realize he was standing before someone who saw him not as a man, but as the key to a treasure. The more he became enchanted by Veronica, the more distant he became from Emily's silent loyalty. He greeted her automatically, almost mechanically, as if she were just part of the furniture that kept the house running. And yet Emily didn't let resentment overwhelm her. There was a strange calm in her eyes, as if she accepted that fate would balance the scales. One rainy night, Veronica arrived at the mansion carrying a bottle of imported wine. She said it was a gift for Alexander, a toast to the future they could build together. He, enchanted, didn't realize that the gift was just another step in her strategy. Emily, from the kitchen, watched the scene in silence, but something inside her screamed that the wine was not just a symbol of affection. There was invisible poison, not in the liquid, but in the intention. During dinner, Veronica talked about risky investments, suggested new business ventures, and always seemed to push Alexander into quick decisions, leaving no time for reflection. Emily knew there were hidden traps in every proposal, but she said nothing. She just watched, like someone watching the sea slowly advance until it swallows the shore. That night, when everyone was asleep, Emily went to the dining room to collect the glasses. One of them had wine left, still half empty. As she smelled the aroma, she remembered something she'd heard among the staff. Veronica was known in certain circles for seducing wealthy men and leaving them ruined. Emily's heart sank with the certainty that Alexander was heading toward an abyss he couldn't see. She climbed the stairs in silence, passing through the hallway where family portraits watched over the house like eternal witnesses. And as she retreated to her room, she told herself she wouldn't interfere. Fate is wise, she thought, and sooner or later, everyone reaps what they sow. And at that moment, she had no idea how close karma was to revealing itself. The mansion, once a space of silence and order, began to transform under Veronica's increasingly constant presence. The servants whispered in the hallways, intrigued by how quickly this woman had captured not only Alexander's attention, but also his heart. Emily, however, wasn't fooled by appearances. Her eyes saw beyond the glitter of the expensive dresses and the soft voice. She noticed the coldness in Veronica's gestures, the calculated way she observed everything around her, as if mapping out a territory to be conquered. Alexander, enchanted and blinded by his own vanity, opened more and more doors for his new companion. He introduced her at events, took her to business dinners, and even began sharing information he had previously kept secret. The millionaire, accustomed to being courted by money, now became easy prey for those who knew how to manipulate his weaknesses. And Veronica knew it. Every compliment was measured, every smile carried intention, and every touch was a promise of something greater, but only in exchange for blind trust. Emily watched it all with a broken heart. Part of her felt pain at seeing the man she loved so blatantly deceived, but another part carried the strange certainty that fate would not allow this. Story to end in triumph for the imposter. Karma, silently, was beginning to show its signs. Small flaws began to appear in Veronica's masks. A slip in conversation, a lost look when she thought no one was watching, a poorly crafted lie that Emily accurately captured. One Sunday afternoon, Alexander invited close friends to lunch at the mansion. Veronica naturally was at his side, exuding charm and confidence. But mid-conversation, she made a mistake. She mentioned a multi-million-dollar investment that Alexander had never revealed to her. Silence fell over the table for a second, and Emily, who was discreetly serving the guests, noticed the discomfort on her boss's face. He covered it up, laughed, and changed the subject, but something inside him began to stir. Later, alone in his office, Alexander remembered that detail. How had she known something he'd never mentioned? Doubt took root in his mind, but it was soon drowned out by the fascination he felt, the blinding beauty, the need to feel desired. Veronica sensed the tension and easily won him back, but the seed of distrust had already been sown. Emily, who watched everything silently, didn't celebrate. She knew it was still early. Karma doesn't act immediately. It prefers to build its path slowly so that the impact is devastating. And she waited patiently, because deep down she knew Alexander would have to fall to learn to get up. That night, as the rain beat down on the mansion's windows again, Veronica glided through the living room as if she owned the place. Emily watched her from afar, clutching the tray tightly, and had the strangest feeling that something much bigger was about to happen, as if the walls of the house held secrets and the wind that blew through the cracks whispered omens. And though no one knew it, the game had already begun, and the price of Alexander's blindness was about to be exacted. The days that followed were like a slow web being woven around Alexander. Veronica, skilled at her game, began suggesting small changes to his routine. At first they were simple pieces of advice: a new restaurant to close deals, a piece of jewelry as a gift to impress a client, a safe investment in a seemingly promising project. Alexander, accustomed to believing in his own infallible intuition, accepted each of her ideas as if they were strokes of genius. The fascination he felt made him vulnerable, and with each step he took trusting her, the deeper he became entangled. Emily, from her silent perch, watched with watchful eyes. With each contract he signed without reading it completely, each check he wrote without hesitation, she felt as if she were watching a house built on sand. It was impossible not to wonder when the tide would come in, and what would be left of Alexander after the wave. The millionaire, who once seemed untouchable, was beginning to show small cracks, not in his fortune, but in his confidence. The sparkle at his parties was no longer as spontaneous, and the smiles he flashed around Veronica hid discreet concerns. One particular night, Veronica convinced him to attend a meeting at an exclusive club. Emily wasn't present, but rumors among the drivers and staff reached her. Alexander had signed a multi-million-dollar deal without even consulting his lawyers, simply because Veronica had assured him it would be the biggest turning point of his life. When he returned home that night, he was different. He didn't say a word to Emily as he crossed the aisle. Hall just walked upstairs with a distant look in his eyes, and it was in that silence that Emily knew for sure. The abyss was closer than ever. But karma is patient, and before destroying, it likes to give signs. One day, while discreetly cleaning the office, Emily found a folder of documents on the desk. She didn't dare touch it, but her eyes caught a detail. Numbers that didn't add up, signatures from people she'd never heard of. It was as if Alexander had unwittingly stepped into a minefield. Emily's heart sank, but she remained silent. Fate would reveal the truth. Veronica, growing bolder by the minute, began acting as if she owned the mansion. She gave instructions to the servants, made disparaging comments about Emily, insinuating that her job could easily be replaced. Alexander didn't interfere. He seemed unaware of the venom hidden in those words. Emily, however, didn't respond. She had learned to bear the weight of humiliation in silence, and perhaps it was precisely this attitude that strengthened her, while the other lost herself in her own ambition. One morning, Emily woke to hurried footsteps echoing down the hallway. She peeked discreetly through the crack in the door and saw Veronica hurrying down the stairs, carrying a heavy bag. The next day, Alexander absently mentioned that some of his important documents were missing. He didn't suspect her, but Emily knew. Veronica was moving too fast, and soon there would be no hiding the truth. The game was underway, and each piece moved toward the inevitable climax. Alexander, blinded by desire and vanity, was heading toward his own ruin. Veronica, drunk on greed, didn't realize that the same fate that gave her power would soon rip it all away from her with the same violence. And Emily, her heart marked by pain and loyalty, simply watched. Because she knew deep down that no one escapes what they deserve. Sooner or later, karma comes to exact its toll. The following weeks were marked by a strange silence in the mansion. The glow of dinners, parties, and gatherings had transformed into an almost palpable tension. Alexander no longer walked with the same confidence he once had. There were shadows in his eyes and unease in his gestures. The business dealings that had always seemed impeccable began to show signs of fragility, and although he tried to hide it from everyone, Emily saw the truth in the details. She could see it in the way he held his folders, in the prolonged time spent on the phone, in the glass of whiskey that remained full for hours as he stared into space. Veronica, on the other hand, seemed more radiant than ever. Her laughter echoed louder, her clothes became increasingly extravagant, and her presence more commanding. She spoke of travel, international partnerships, and a future of greatness. But behind that facade, Emily saw the desperation of someone racing against time to suck as much as possible before everything collapsed. And that moment wouldn't be far off. The first blow came discreetly, a call received in the early hours of the morning. Emily, passing through the hallway, heard Alexander's raised voice. Banks were questioning suspicious transfers, contracts signed without guarantees, and huge sums of money that had disappeared into offshore accounts. Veronica, sitting beside him, whispered sweet excuses, convincing him it was all just a temporary misunderstanding. Alexander, desperate to believe, clung to her every word like a castaway to a plank. But Emily, motionless in the hallway, knew fate had already delivered its verdict. In the following days, the demands began to pile up. Invitations to events disappeared, business friends avoided the mansion, and rumors of bankruptcy began to circulate among the city's business people. Alexander, who until recently had been synonymous with power and wealth, was now the target of whispers and suspicious glances. Veronica, still by his side, tried to maintain her mask, but her impatience grew. She demanded more money, pressured him to sell properties, and increasingly concealed her true colors. Emily watched everything in silence, doing her job as if nothing had changed, but inside she felt a mixture of pain and relief. It hurt to see the man she loved lose himself in such blind mistakes, but there was also the relentless justice of karma, which was finally beginning to exact its price for indifference, vanity, and poor choices. One rainy night, Alexander descended the stairs. Alone. Veronica had left without explanation, and the mansion was shrouded in shadow. He found Emily discreetly tidying the living room and, for the first time in a long time, looked into her eyes. There was a deep weariness there, a silent plea for understanding, but no words were spoken. He simply walked past her as if carrying the weight of 1,000 defeats on his shoulders. And in that moment, Emily understood something she'd never dared admit. The millionaire was no longer untouchable. He was about to be destroyed by the same fire he'd ignited when he chose to blind himself, and when the abyss finally opened, nothing could stop him from falling. The clock of destiny was already ticking down Alexander's final hours as a powerful man, and in the silence of the house each tick seemed to announce that his downfall was imminent and devastating. News of Alexander's downfall spread through the city like wildfire. Financial newspapers ran headlines about his failed business dealings, broken contracts and massive debts that until recently would have been unthinkable for someone of his stature. The man who had symbolized solidity and wealth was now seen as an example of recklessness and arrogance. Investors demanded explanations, creditors knocked on his doors, and the mansion that had once been the scene of lavish parties was transformed into a silent haven of shame. Veronica, who until then had presented herself as a loyal companion, soon showed her true colors. In the first meetings, when the tension became unbearable, she discreetly withdrew, avoiding direct association with his failures. When close friends of Alexander's disappeared, she too began to distance herself, citing commitments and last-minute trips, and soon made it clear that her presence was conditional on what remained of his fortune. The love Alexander had believed he had won revealed itself as it was from the beginning, an illusion bought with the glitter of money. Emily watched in silence. She watched the man who had once seemed unattainable lose not only his riches, but also the admiration of those around him. And despite the pain of witnessing his downfall, she felt a bitter sense of justice. Fate was relentless. He had chosen to give his heart to a stranger with dark intentions, and now he was paying the price. The mansion's servants began to leave work, fearing their salaries would no longer be paid. The once lively house became empty and silent. Alexander walked the halls like a shadow, carrying in his eyes the disbelief of someone who had always believed himself untouchable. Veronica, increasingly distant, no longer made any effort to hide her contempt. She complained about the lack of parties, the absence of gifts, the decay the mansion was sinking into. And at a dinner where only the three of them were present, Alexander, Veronica, and Emily serving in silence, the mask completely slipped. "You're nothing but a broken man," Veronica said coldly, setting her wineglass on the table. The words echoed through the empty room like a fatal blow. Alexander, stunned, couldn't respond. He simply stared at the woman he'd thought was his refuge and finally realized she'd never been there for him. Emily, her heart aching, watched the scene without saying a word. That same night, Veronica packed her things and left. There was no goodbye, no explanation. She walked out the front door with the same confidence she had entered months earlier, but now carrying with her not just memories, but also some of the riches Alexander had naively given her. The millionaire was left alone, surrounded by echoes of a life that no longer existed. Emily watched Veronica's car disappear from the window onto the dark road. And though she had reason to feel revenge or relief, what dominated her chest was only a heavy silence. She knew that fate had acted, that karma had taken its toll, and that Alexander, stripped of illusions, would have to face the emptiness that remained. And in that mansion, now cold and lonely, a new chapter began. That of public downfall transformed into personal humiliation. The mansion, once lit by parties and surrounded by applause, had become an empty, dark, almost ghostly place. Alexander walked through those corridors like a stranger in his own home, hearing only the echo of footsteps that no longer led anywhere. The family portraits hanging on the walls seemed to observe him sternly, as if silently judging him for the choices he had made. The man who had once been a symbol of power was now reduced to someone lost in his own solitude. Creditors knocked relentlessly on his door. Summonses, threats, and notices piled up on his desk. Each opened envelope was another stone tied to the weight of his conscience. Alexander, who had always believed himself invincible, now felt the fragility of a castle built on sand. His assets began to be confiscated. Luxury cars disappeared from the garage. Valuable paintings were removed from the walls, and each loss was more painful because it wasn't just material. It was the demolition of his image in the world. Meanwhile, Veronica remained a distant shadow, her memory alive only in the perfume that still permeated certain rooms and the objects she had taken with her. The void she left wasn't just financial but emotional. Alexander realized, too late, that there had never been love. He had been used, manipulated, and discarded. This realization hurt more than the debts, because it reached his soul, dismantling the arrogance that had kept him afloat. Emily, faithful to her silence, was still present. She tidied the remaining rooms, prepared simple meals, kept the house minimally alive. But now there was something different in her eyes. She was no longer the young woman in love harboring illusions, but a woman observing the downfall with the serenity of someone who understands that fate never fails. Still, as much as she felt justice in what was happening, she couldn't help but see the man behind the ruin, and deep down a quiet compassion blossomed, even in the face of the pain he had caused her. One evening, Alexander came downstairs, his expression haggard. He sat at the enormous table, now devoid of gleam, and sat there for long minutes in silence. Emily approached carrying a bowl of simple soup and placed it in front of him. He looked up, met her gaze, and for the first time there was neither pride nor indifference, only vulnerability. He didn't say thank you, but Emily sensed that in that silent gesture, Alexander recognized something he'd never noticed before. She had always been there, loyal, true, unlike the woman he'd chosen. In the early hours of the morning, alone in his office, Alexander stared at his reflection in the window. The man he'd seen before with the impeccable suit and arrogant gaze was gone. All that remained was someone marked by defeat, humiliation, and the certainty that his choices had led him to the brink. He wondered if there would be a way back, if he would ever regain his lost dignity. But he already understood one thing. Fate had given him the chance to see the truth through the pain. Emily, in her simple room upstairs, prayed silently. She didn't ask for revenge. She didn't ask for miracles, just for the courage to endure what was yet to come. Because she knew the story didn't end there. Karma never closes its cycles smoothly. There was still more to be revealed. And in the darkness of that night, there hung in the air the feeling that Alexander's downfall was not the end, but the beginning of a greater upheaval, one that no one, not even he, could have imagined. If Alexander had previously been greeted with applause at dinners and his presence at social events was sought after, he now encountered closed doors and eyes that avoided meeting his. The city, so quick to elevate a man to a pedestal, was even more ruthless in tearing him down. Invitations that had arrived in piles disappeared. Former business friends didn't answer his calls. Those who had once applauded him now spoke of him in poisoned whispers in the hallways of expensive hotels and restaurants. He, who had always walked the streets as a symbol of success, came to be seen as an example of failure. The humiliations began subtly, but soon became explicit. At a cafe in the financial district, a former business partner ran into him by chance and, instead of greeting him, got up from the table and left, as if Alexander's presence were an embarrassment. On another occasion, during a meeting where he was seeking to renegotiate debts, he heard muffled laughter as he left the room, the cruel sound of men who had once flattered him, now reveling in his misfortune. The mansion, increasingly empty, reflected this decay. Cars and furniture were hauled away in trucks, while bailiffs came and went as if they owned the place. Emily, always present, watched each evacuation with silent eyes, but never judged him. Out loud, she simply maintained her discreet demeanor, preparing what remained of simple meals, cleaning the rooms already nearly stripped of luxury, as if preserving a modicum of dignity amidst collapse. Alexander, however, began to feel not only the weight of material loss, but the loneliness of abandonment. Veronica had completely disappeared, taking part of his fortune with her and leaving a trail of dishonor. Friends of convenience ignored him, and even distant relatives who had previously taken pride in using his surname to open doors now pretended not to know him. The millionaire who believed he was admired for his greatness discovered that everything was merely a reflection of his possessions, and without wealth there was no respect. One afternoon, as he left a bank after yet another negative response, Alexander was approached by a reporter. The question, posed on camera, sounded like a sentence. "Mr. Alexander, do you believe your downfall was due solely to bad business dealings or to trusting the wrong people?" He didn't answer. He simply looked at the ground and got into his car with heavy steps, burdened with the shame of having his story exposed as an example of greed and recklessness. Emily, watching the report later on the kitchen television, felt a shiver. Not of pleasure at his misfortune, but at the clarity with which fate acted. Karma was not content to punish in silence. It insisted on exposing the truth before everyone, so that the lesson would be indelibly engraved. That night, Alexander sat alone at the mansion's massive table. There were no crystal glasses, no elegant guests, just the sound of rain beating on the windows and the emptiness of solitude. Emily placed a simple plate of food before him, and as she walked away, he felt something inside him shift. For the first time, he seemed willing to see beyond himself, and so, in the depths of his fall, something different began to germinate. A pain that perhaps was also the beginning of a transformation. But before it could blossom, there would still be more to be shed, more masks to fall, more humiliations to endure. For fate is patient, and karma only completes its work when the soul learns what it needs to learn. The nights in the mansion became long and heavy, filled only with the distant sound of wind rustling through the cracks in the windows. Silence, once a sign of power and control, was now a cruel companion, exposing every memory, every wrong choice, every false. Smile Alexander had accepted as truth. He, who once slept in expensive sheets and woke to commitments and flattery, now found himself alone in a space that seemed too large for his solitude. Little by little, the weight of his absence became unbearable. Veronica had left without a backward glance, and the friends who claimed to admire him were nothing more than echoes of convenience that dissipated at the first sign of weakness. Not even the servants who had served the mansion for years remained. They had all gone, seeking stability elsewhere. Everyone except Emily. She remained. Not out of obligation, not out of hope of reward, but because her loyalty was silent and unwavering. She continued preparing simple meals, keeping the rooms tidy, erasing the traces of a grandeur that no longer existed. Alexander watched her walk the halls, discreet and firm, and began to realize something he had never allowed himself to notice before. She didn't need luxury to be whole, didn't need recognition to be true. In solitude, he began to notice details he'd previously ignored. Emily's calloused hands, yet still moving gently, her serene gaze, never betraying pride or vanity. The silence that wasn't emptiness, but presence. For the first time, Alexander felt there was someone there who had never abandoned him, even when everyone else had disappeared. But this awakening wasn't without pain. Many nights, drowning in cheap whiskey, he stared at the ceiling and wondered how he'd ever been so blind. He remembered the night Veronica appeared beside him, the dinner Emily had prepared that was never meant for her, and he felt a searing guilt. How could he despise someone who had always treated him with dignity, only to give his heart to someone who only wanted to destroy it? Emily, for her part, never threw anything in his face. There were no accusatory words, no irony, only her silence, which was more eloquent than any speech. This silence consumed him, because it reflected the judgment that fate had already decreed. One early morning, Alexander found her in the garden, gathering dried flowers. The moon illuminated her face, and for a moment he stood still, watching her, as if seeing her for the first time. He approached slowly, but words failed him. He only said a barely audible, "Thank you," as if his voice were rusted by the arrogance he had carried all his life. Emily looked up, surprised, and responded with only a slight nod, without a smile, without rancor. A simple gesture, but one that brought Alexander a strange sense of relief. In the following days, the ruined millionaire began to lean on her presence almost involuntarily. Emily was neither a friend nor a confidant, but her mere presence was what kept the mansion from falling into complete ruin. And though he didn't say it out loud, Alexander understood. His life was now reduced to its bare essentials, and in that essential, only she remained. The morning began grey, with clouds hovering over New York, as if the sky too carried the weight of Alexander's debts. The bailiff arrived early, delivering a thick envelope that contained, for the first time, more than just charges. A summons to testify about financial transactions made during the months Veronica entered his life. There were unfamiliar names, offshore accounts, signatures that looked like his, but whose lines wavered like someone writing in the dark. Alexander stood in the hall, holding the paper with cold hands, not daring to open the second page. Emily, who was wiping with a damp cloth, sensed that behind the silence there was panic. She approached unhurriedly, like someone approaching a wounded animal, and simply said she would make coffee. He didn't answer, but his shoulders sagged a little, as if that quiet voice were the only solid thing left. At noon, Alexander crossed the city to the office of the lawyer recommended by an acquaintance who hadn't completely abandoned him yet. The Midtown building mirrored a man he no longer recognized. The lawyer leafed through the documents, speaking of breach of trust, sophisticated fraud, co-authorship without full knowledge. He said it was possible to prove Veronica had masterminded everything, but it would require a string of facts, dates, people, proof of the pattern of manipulation. On the way back, the subway seemed more honest than any luxury car he'd owned. There were no curtains to hide the truth. Through the scratched glass, Alexander saw neighborhoods he hadn't seen face to face in years, corner stores in Queens, laundromats with neon flickering, ordinary lives going on, even as mansions crumbled. He got off 2 stops early, bought a cheap bouquet at a flower stand, and, without rehearsing, took it home. He didn't know how to deliver it. He left it on the kitchen sideboard, next to the simple stove where Emily kept the house breathing. That afternoon, while organizing a storage closet, Emily found a box of receipts, visitor, badges, garage door openers, and 2 temporary access cards issued around the time Veronica had started staying. There were times that didn't match Alexander's schedule, and a curious entry. 2 early morning entries, made by an unannounced guest. Emily remembered, the image lit up, the night she'd seen Veronica hurry down the stairs with her heavy bag. She picked up the phone, took a deep breath, and after a few seconds called the lawyer's office. She didn't talk about love or hurt. She talked about schedules, side doors, missing documents, and she asked them to keep her name confidential. The lawyer listened without interrupting, asked her to send photos of the receipts, and at the end said, "Thank you," in a tone that sounded for the first time like hope. When Alexander returned, he found Emily chopping vegetables with the precision of someone who'd learned to control herself. He hesitated, opening his mouth twice until he managed to say, "I didn't know what I was doing." She didn't respond. She put water on to boil, lit the flame, and the small pop of the gas became inexplicably a ritual. Without realizing it, he began to help. He washed a pot, fetched dishes, missed the cutlery drawer, and got it right on the second try. What had once seemed impossible, the millionaire in the kitchen, was now only human. And as they stirred the same simple recipe, the smell of garlic and butter restored the house to a dignity that mirrors cannot provide. Later, they sat at the table without a linen tablecloth, without candles, without anything but 2 ordinary glass goblets and a shared plate. Alexander took a deep breath and finally said what he should have said on the first night. "I'm sorry for what I did to you." No speech, no self-defense, just the bare phrase which fell to Emily's heart like rain after a long summer. She neither accepted nor refused. She simply held his gaze, allowing the guilt to find a place to transform. The phone rang. It was the lawyer. Emily's information matched names raised by private investigators, hired by creditors. There was a pattern. There were witnesses to nighttime outings. There was cross-access to the safes on dates when Alexander was out of the country. "This may prevent the worst," said the voice on the other end, "but it will hurt. The mansion will be auctioned. The account will be almost empty. Still, the heaviest burden can be lifted." Alexander hung up slowly, his eyes wet, not with fear, but with the relief of discovering that perhaps the truth had after all some ground to stand on. That night, the power went out for a few minutes. Another overdue bill. Emily lit matches and distributed candles without fanfare, as if illuminating a small altar of things that survive. A simple plate, two hands working side by side, the silence that ceased to be an accusation and became a shelter. The flame wavered, reflected in the window, and for a second, the kitchen felt like the exact opposite of the first night. Now there was no luxury to dazzle anyone, but there was presence. From the gate, headlights cut through the darkness, then the sharp sound of a knock on the door. Emily and Alexander exchanged glances, as if knowing life doesn't allow for rest on the eve of New Year's Eve. When he opened the door, two figures stood on the porch, an agent with a sealed envelope and a woman in a trench coat, her gaze firm, her pass hanging around her neck. Her voice carried through the hallway like a sentence and a promise. We need to talk about Veronica, and about what happens tomorrow morning. The room, lit only by candles, seemed to breathe with them. Alexander, with trembling hands, took the envelope from the agent, while the woman in the trench coat entered and introduced herself as a federal investigator. There was concrete evidence. Veronica was wanted for fraud in 3 states, had already swindled other businessmen, and had disappeared with entire fortunes. Alexander was just another piece in her web, but for the first time he had something on his side: records, witnesses, and the indirect testimony of Emily, who had managed to retrieve details no one else had noticed. The document summoned him for a hearing the following morning. It would be painful, would expose his fragility in front of the entire city, but it also offered him a chance to clear his name, to separate naivete from complicity. When the door closed and silence returned, Alexander stared at Emily as if seeing her for the first time. There was a firmness in her eyes that came not from her position as a servant, but from someone who had survived indifference and contempt without being corrupted. For the first time, he realized that all the loyalty he had sought from the wrong people had always been within reach of her silent gaze. The weight of regret made him lower his head, and the tears that flowed were not just from fear of justice, but from shame of the man he had been. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, onlookers, business people, everyone wanted to witness the final downfall of the man who had once been a symbol of success. Alexander entered head down, without the luxurious suits that had made him an icon, but dressed simply, almost ordinary. The judge read the records, the charges, and little by little, Veronica's web was revealed in documents, testimonies, and bank records. The audience murmured at every detail. Alexander, motionless, felt his heart sink, but within him, something new was being born: acceptance. When his lawyer presented the evidence linking him to transactions made without his knowledge, a turning point took over the courtroom. For the first time, the narrative ceased to be about an arrogant millionaire who had lost everything and became a case of cruel manipulation that nearly destroyed a man. The judge suspended some of the most serious charges. Alexander would not emerge unscathed. He would lose the mansion, most of his assets, and would also bear a public mark of recklessness, but the sentence made it clear that Veronica was primarily responsible for the fraud. A warrant had been issued for her arrest. The courtroom emptied into murmurs of surprise. Alexander, sitting on the bench, felt something he hadn't experienced in months: a breath of dignity, not because he was regaining what he had lost, but because he was finally seeing the truth recognized. As he left, camera flashes blinded him, reporters shouted questions, but his response was silence. When he reached the street, he found Emily waiting in the distance. There was no smile, no gesture of celebration, just her presence, solid as ever. They walked together to the simple car that replaced the former luxurious fleet. The ride back was quiet, but in that stillness there was something Alexander had never known: peace. In the now nearly empty mansion, Alexander entered the kitchen and watched Emily arrange simple dishes on the table. There was no gold, no guests, no music, just the two of them, a hot meal, and the feeling that the world had somehow been reordered. He sat down, took a deep breath, and quietly said, "I may never be able to make up for what I've done, but I promise never again to be blind to what truly matters." Emily didn't answer. She simply placed a plate before him and sat down across from him. Outside, The rain had stopped, and the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows. The golden glow illuminated the bare walls, as if to say that luxury wasn't necessary for beauty to exist. Alexander looked at Emily, and for the first time felt that the silence wasn't emptiness, but plenitude. Life had stripped him of all that was superficial, leaving only the essential, truth. And in that simple kitchen, before the woman who had never given up on existing by his side, even when she had been ignored, Alexander understood the symbolic twist of fate. It wasn't wealth that defined his life, but the ability to recognize who remained when all else departed. Karma had exacted its toll, but it had also given him one last chance to learn that true love never needs lit candles or banquets. It was always there, in Emily's faithful silence. If this story spoke to you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and comment "Fate always takes its toll."